This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On this week's episode, I speak to artist, podcaster, and author Brian Alfred. Brian's releasing a new book titled Why I Make Art: Contemporary Artist Stories About Life and Work, which is inspired by more than 300 episodes of his podcast, Sound and Vision. Brian also has an exhibition of new paintings opening this week at Miles McEnery in New York. We discussed the new book, his new paintings, and tried to get to the heart of what makes him tick. And now, my conversation about a wide variety of things with Brian Alfred. Brian Alfred, I really appreciate you being willing to come on the podcast, talk about your new book, Why I Make Art: Contemporary Artist Stories About Life and Work. And you also have a show coming up soon at Miles McEnery Gallery. But, you're an artist, a podcaster, an educator, now an author. I guess, really the book kind of goes hand in hand with the podcast, right? And so how would you describe the two?
So the podcast is just, my goal with that and the mission of it, which I don't even know when I started if there was really a mission, but, what the mission became was basically to, provide conversations with, fellow artists that weren't scripted or were very laid back, almost like a studio visit. Mm-hmm. Because the podcast that I was listening to while driving to teach, I wanted long ones and I wanted them to be sort of laid back conversation, or those are the ones that I responded to. So people just BSing like actors or musicians. And I didn't feel like there was much in the art realm of that. So, I wanted to kind of create that, I guess.
I guess I started listening to Sound and Vision probably around 2017. But when did it start? Was it like 2015, 14? What?
I think it was 16. My memory is real bad, but I think it was 2016. But the thing is I quote unquote started it, like a year, and I think it was about a year and a half, maybe a little more before I actually released it. So in the sense that I was, learning how to do it and doing research and, talking to friends about recording. And luckily I had some, music and recording experience in my life. So I had a touchstone for that, but, I wanted to do it right. And so I basically took a while to get it going, and then, so once it actually released, I think it was April 2016, if I'm not mistaken. And then it just kept going from there.
Your conversations, there always seemed to be a Brooklyn sort of focus in terms of where the artists were working out of. Did you start with just personal relationships and just start kind of working out from there?
Definitely. I felt like, if I can talk to people I know or have a history with at the beginning, that will create a sort of, a little bit of a relaxed entry point than jumping right into like a quote unquote interview with someone I have no idea who it, with, Jasper Johns or something. I think I'd be a little kind of uptight. So, and that wasn't what I was going for. I was going for the studio visit vibe. So, right. Yeah, I started asking friends, and I was lucky enough to have been working at that point for like over 17 years in the art world and knew a lot of people. So, I had some guests who came on who people know their work. And I think that kind of, that helped start the process, I think.
I know when I first started podcasting, it was like I couldn't get enough of content like yours. And I think that kind of motivated me to go out and start creating my own content. I mean, was that kind of part of the motivation? Was that you felt like the conversations you wanted to hear just you weren't getting enough?
Yeah, 100%. It was, I didn't realize it explicitly until I started listening to a lot of podcasts. And I think that I got into a groove of the kind that I like, which were these longer conversations that were, famous people talking about like what they ate for breakfast or whatever, or what they were listening to on the way to set, or comedians talking about, where they eat dinner after their shows, stuff like that. And the more I listened to those and thought about it, it's like, you never really get to hear artists speak, or at least I wasn't aware of, outside studio visits, of hearing them just be normal human beings. Every time they're interviewed, it's like this formal, so what are you using in that painting and that part of the sculpture, that stuff. So I kind of wanted to show the human side of artists.
When you look back, and obviously you have looked back to put this book together, what are some of the common themes or where you see maybe how this wide variety of artists are similar, and maybe some examples where they're drastically different?
Yeah, in the beginning, I think I was fishing in a way of like, there must be this thread that pulls it all together. And I think a little bit of that at the beginning was the framework of a lot of artists, grow up drawing as a kid or getting into, like, being creative. And at some point there was like a light bulb went off, or someone said, "Hey, you're good at that." And they were like, "Okay, I'm going to do this." And, in art school is a big structure thing where people, go to study. And I thought, well, there's this thread that maybe I could pull that together. But then I was surprised too that there's a lot of people who worked outside of that framework. And there was a lot of diversity in, what drew people to make work. But the themes are all kind of resonate. It's all kind of, I think it feeds people in some way, shape, or form. I guess everyone does something that they want to do, to feed themselves, feed something inside of them. So I think it kind of micro macroed. It became, there were tons of similarities. And then at the same time, there was a lot of diversity too. So I like that fact, because I feel like any art student listening in their studio can listen to it and they'll hear an artist where they're like, oh, okay, that's what I'm doing, or that's how I feel.
Sure.
And it worked for them. So, that I think is valuable.
Do you have your students in mind when you're asking people questions, and just, your style is really conversational, but do you ever kind of consciously think, this is info that my students would really benefit from?
I think that's become more, I've become more conscious of that as years go on. And then, my students listen, a lot of them listen to the podcast, or I even get messages from other art students or younger artists through DMs or emails or whatever, that maybe it's a little more conscious in my head. I think I'm generally a curious person, and I want to know about people and what makes them tick and how they got to where they got, both in their work and what they're doing and in their mind. And, and it's just sort of snowballed in that sense. I think now I definitely will mine a little bit more, maybe where I would go, a little deeper than the surface, just because I feel like there might be a nugget, like a truth nugget in there that'll be really good for people to hear.
Who are those podcasts that you really enjoy? Is it like Mark Maron or?
Oh yeah, I listen to all kinds of, I listen to a lot of different podcasts, but I don't necessarily listen. Well, I guess there's a few that I listen to, I would say religiously, but I mean, like the one that I listen to the most often, most religiously, is Men in Blazers, because I'm a huge soccer fan and I'm curious. I want to know. They're hilarious. They're super intelligent, and I just want to hear about how they break down each week's matches, and so, and then I listen to, Rich Roll, and I'll listen to, Mark Maron or Pete Holmes or The Daily Show, or, like my friend Rishi does Song Exploder, which I love, which is a totally different kind of podcast. I listen to, Serial, and that first series was amazing, and yeah, so I listened to quite a few, and I probably try, maybe unconsciously take some from all those, anyone asking questions. It's the same kind of thing with art. I'll look at everything and I make work, and I don't think that everything I look at necessarily enters my work directly, but it all kind of informs a sensibility unconsciously.
I've always loved the studio visit aspect of your conversations. And I mean, it's just, they seem so natural. I think one of the things that I would love for you to kind of reflect on is, I know during the pandemic, it was hard for these conversations to actually take place in the studio. Have you thought about comparing and contrasting the benefits of those conversations actually taking place face to face in the workspace versus remotely.
Yeah, definitely. I think, when I was doing, I would say 95 to 98% of them in person, whether it's at a gallery where the show is, or, I felt that face to face, because I was talking to them about personal things.
Mm-hmm.
It's ironic because I think the studio visit, the quote unquote studio visit talk, I think a lot of people would perceive that as like, oh, well, you're there around the art talking about the art. A lot of times when I go to someone's studio and I'm talking to them, we don't talk about the art necessarily that much. We're talking about, oh shit, like what did you do today? It's just the sort of day to day stuff. And I think that what happened when I had to move into the Zoom realm of doing podcasts, I maybe at that point I've been doing it long enough that I had confidence with it, but I realized that it's really the person that I'm trying to get to, in their story. So you can do that. It's nice being face to face because there's a different kind of physicality to the conversation, but it's not necessarily about being in someone's studio because of the art. It's more about being near them and feeling their presence in that sense. But I feel like I don't think it's dropped off as far as, the connection that I've made with people. But maybe people are just getting more used to being, in Zooms or being online.
You mentioned earlier about how much you love the long format podcasts because of your commute. How long is that commute, Brian? Because, you live in one state and work in another.
Yeah. It's just under 4 hours if I'm aggressive. If I take my time, it's like 4.5 hours or something.
So I've always been curious what your week looks like, because the 4.5 hour commute sounds
Brutal.
interesting. Right. I mean, do you have an apartment, where you spend the night and come? Like, how does your week play out? Because I've always been curious about that.
Yeah, I can break it down for you. I'm on sabbatical this year, though. I might say
great.
that has been really nice because having 2 solo shows and doing a book, it's the perfect time for it, to be honest. So I'm not making the commute. I haven't been making it since, and COVID happened. So I haven't been to Pennsylvania in years, which is weird. I mean, what is time after COVID? But normally what happens is I teach Tuesday and Thursday and occasionally a Wednesday night class if it's a seminar, or Tuesday night. But what I do is I wake up really early, and leave the city at like 4 or 5 a.m. and beat the traffic. And then I get to Penn State, and then I'll stay 2 nights, and I stay at like an old timey hotel that I work a deal out where I just get a room for 2 nights each week. And when I was in New Haven, a lot of my professors did that. They just stayed at a hotel next to the art school, and they didn't drop anchor and like live in an apartment there. So that's what I do. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, so I feel very confident. I went to Penn State as an undergrad, so I feel comfortable with that. But yeah, I stay 2 nights, and then after my class, I hop in the car and drive home. I love driving. I should say that. And I spent a long time being in a band, going on tour, and driving, like really drive. That's driving. So when you drive across the country, and I've done that countless times, driving to Penn State feels like nothing. It's like 2 long podcasts and I'm there.
But you're not still driving a white panel van, right?
That's true. Yeah, we only had a conversion van for that last tour. We did it pretty raw. We had like a pickup truck and another car that we did. But yeah, no, I'm driving a regular car with air conditioning.
So the podcast, the sound and vision, and so the vision part's the visual art. The sound, my impression was that in the beginning, maybe you had an idea that you would alternate between musicians and visual artists. And I know it's kind of coming around, and you always ask people what's playing in the studio. But can you kind of tell me what about that side of your vision for the podcast?
Yeah, I guess when I thought of doing it, I felt like I'm going to talk to a lot of artists, but I would also talk to musicians as well, because I have a lot of friends who are musicians and a lot of friends who are artists who play music. And I've had a long history of playing music, and it's been a big part of my life. So I wanted to leave that aspect of it available. and not just, quote unquote fine artists. Or so, I've had sprinklings of musicians in, throughout the the episodes, and I've also talked to a lot of artists who do mess around and play music, or will jam on the side or have DJ'd or whatever it is. But usually artists have a relationship to music, and musicians always have a relation to art because they do cover art, and they, a lot of them have visuals for shows and all that stuff. So, I just, it's I guess selfish in a way that I just wanted to have that option open. The other side of it real quick is that when I critique or when I'm teaching, I often bring up music as a parallel for thinking about critique or thinking about expression, because I feel like it's a great, almost like completely different but very similar way of sort of expressing yourself. And a lot of times I feel like music can ease the critique, or it can ease an artist into thinking like, oh, okay, I see, like that's a nice sort of like parallel discussion of tones, like colors. Or I do that a lot with music. So I think that it's a natural habitat for me to place music in the context of talking about art, almost probably to a fault or annoyance when I ask people what their paintings or sculptures sound like, or what are they listening to. That I'm just really interested in that.
Okay, so I want to know more about that. I mean, do you actually have them critique a Kanye song, or is it just like, do you kind of give them a frame of reference, or is it just in terms of speaking in terms of metaphors, using musical metaphors in terms of the language?
It's probably a little bit of all that, but mostly I think, if you look at, like, a lot of the discussion about art is couched in art history and what came before it. And, why is this relevant to what came before it? And why are we making this now? Or what does this mean? Like, it's that, the language of visual information is seen through the sieve of the past, and it's part of the language. And with music, I think the linearity of music, or where it comes from and the connections to it, sometimes are a little more raw and direct. Like if you hear like Daft Punk, you can think, okay, disco, funk, soul, R&B, and that comes from blues. And like there's a pretty straight lineage there that you can see. So often I'll do that, where I'll bring up like a connection between how music has progressed, or the way creativity has progressed through influence in music, and then maybe draw that as a parallel. And then sometimes it's about expressiveness, like something like a minimal, like, EDM track versus Ornette Coleman's free jazz with two drummers playing like, at the same time in chaos. I think if you bring that into a discussion about chaos and control in painting, it can be an interesting way to sort of think about it differently, other than just, Jackson Pollock versus, Agnes Martin.
When you laid out your book, did you lay it out kind of topically where things overlapped in these conversations, or is it kind of going from extract to extract from some of the best of moments?
Yeah, what happened was when I first started, the idea of maybe having a book, or this podcast existing in another realm where people who don't listen to podcasts can still engage in the content. I had an idea that it was just going to be these, excerpts, like all these excerpts from the conversations that are just, a lot of the great ones that I felt like were great conversations, maybe the whole thing, and then maybe just snippets of things related to theme. And then, working with the publisher and talking to friends and like thinking through the ideas, it kind of morphed, because that would just be basically, a transcription of the podcast, which I don't think would be the most interesting thing to just sit there and read. So we've actually had, a few writers write sort of like pieces about the artists that, we selected 30 artists who, we feel was a diverse cast of people who make amazing work. And, there's these written pieces that use quotes from the podcast and sort of flesh out the story of these people. And, I wrote a sort of piece at the beginning talking about how the podcast came to be, what it means to me, the intention, the sort of significance of it. And then there's these sort of written pieces on the 30 artists. And then there's the sort of quotes or snippets based on theme, whether it's music or art school, because there's little great nuggets in these conversations. Just like I love the idea of just having a quote from Chris Martin about Miles Davis or something, or seeing Basquiat, and then someone else talking about how critiques sucked at art school or something. Like it's kind of a fun thing to just delve into. And I think I drifted away from it being like a documentation of the podcast necessarily, and more of an extension of the artist that I've talked to, and fleshing it out more.
Brian, I thought it might be fun if we play a word association game. It's sort of a Brian Alfred drinking game, kind of a bingo.
I haven't done that in a while.
A bingo card of Brian Alfred terms. And so, well, maybe I could throw some things at you. What about blue collar work ethic?
So you want me to just basically
Sure. What is that?
Respond.
Yeah, respond.
That's my dad. My dad was a hardworking guy, and I think that really rubbed off on me, and it informed my life, because he worked double shifts and he drove a truck, and that's my whole life. It's just like blue collar, working hard, and I think that's woven into me. So I'm sure when I talk to other people, there's that touchstone. Just like I feel like Pittsburgh is like that.
Yeah,
it's part of me.
Sure. Well, that was another square on the bingo card. No, it's fine. But let me ask you, just to follow up on that. I mean, that's ingrained in you, right? And so, how do you see it manifesting itself in your work?
In the sense that I just can't stop working. Like I find, I think unconsciously, I'm motivated to work hard at stuff, because that was what I saw. And my mother too worked like crazy. So, it's what I was around, and there was just an honesty in it. I think it wasn't about like getting rich or trying to make a lot of money, because we certainly weren't there. It was just about, you just got to work hard. And that was like when I played soccer, it was like, my dad always taught me just do it, And when I changed from being a medical student at University of Pittsburgh to, an art major at Penn State, my parents were basically like, it doesn't matter what you do, just work 150% at it, So I think that it's just kind of like ingrained, and it makes, to this day, maybe to a fault, I just can't take a break.
All right. So blue collar, Pittsburgh, Warhol.
Yeah. I was watching the past couple of nights, I've been watching that new documentary, and which has been great. And talking to friends over social media about it, people sending me messages, and, I don't know. It's weird. It's kind of like, I don't know how to divorce myself from my feelings and familiarity with Warhol coming from Pittsburgh, because he was so prevalent at an early age. Like I always saw Warhol stuff. But I do think, knowing reading the books that I've read and going to the museum, and, and investing a lot of sort of like my interest in Warhol, I do think that the general population, art viewing population, has a certain perception of him that was just surface. And there was a lot going on there that he kind of, hid away from in his personality and his sort of self-consciousness. And, and he was really conscious of everything and extremely intelligent. And obviously no one who makes work after Warhol doesn't have Warhol in the work in some way, shape, or form. So, I mean, I'm a fan.
Yeah. So how does Warhol show up in your work?
Pretty directly, I think. I mean, I think both Warhol, the sensibility of maybe, here's the most direct way. Warhol had this adage of like, I'm not that interesting. Like, it's not about me, it's about the work. So it was kind of like holding a mirror to society, and a lot of times, popular culture. And I don't think I'm interesting necessarily, but I want to show viewers how I'm looking at the world, that what I find interesting about the places around us and the people around us. So I think that's like a very similar sort of mindset, and those early paintings, like those, the dancing drawing, like schematics, and the typewriter that's unfinished with the pencil on it. And some of those early Warhol paintings really burned into my visual mind. And the suicide paintings and the car crash paintings, those always like hit pretty hard, and when I think of Warhol, flowers don't pop up, and Elvis doesn't pop up. It's those disaster series, or the piss paintings and stuff like that I really think are where he let the grit in, or Empire, which I think is one of the most amazing, you know meditations on urban life and visuals. It's just, I think that stuff really burned into my visual mind.
It's always curious to wonder how much of his public persona was performance art, right? Like people, I think a lot of people, on the periphery kind of think that's who Andy Warhol was, but I really wonder who he was when he was Andrew Warhol living with his mom in some apartment, right?
Yeah, definitely. And if you look at his early work and his drawings and what he was doing when he first moved to the city, and you could see his hand in there, and you knew that his mother did like the text things. I mean, there was a real bond there, and the quote unquote performance art of it, I feel like, was more about him hiding his self consciousness, or what he was, about things that he felt uncomfortable about himself. So it wasn't so much that he was trying to be, like, I'm going to be this, this person. It was more of like wearing a mask, to protect his insecurities, seemingly.
All right, so we've got Blue Collar, Warhol, Pittsburgh. What about Skowhegan?
Skowhegan. That was Skowhegan for me was the perfect thing at the perfect time, because I just came out of 2 years of grad school, which were, hyper rigorous, very competitive, tense atmosphere. And then the next thing you know, you're like out in this farthest studio through a cow pasture making work, and no one's there really. And I have all the time in the world, and people who came in weren't quote unquote teachers. They were just like, fellow participants. And it was a real laid back kind of communal vibe. And my work was able to go through a huge transition there over just 9 weeks. So it was pretty amazing. And I didn't go into the lake, and everyone teased me about it, but they all got duck itch whenever they went in there. So that taught me a lesson too. Stick to your guns. If you don't want to do something, don't fold to the peer pressure.
That's awesome. So did you make relationships there that you kind of, because it's sort of a summer camp sort of vibe, right?
Yeah, there's other terminology that went along with what happens at Skowhegan, but yeah, it was real. It felt very summer of love. No one's around. You know what I mean?
Wow.
Like you were back then. We were off the grid. I mean, there was one computer in the office area that had internet, which was like dial up, and it was this is 1999, so it wasn't like it was blowing up yet. So you were really off the grid.
Right.
And, things could get wild. Yeah, it was fun. It was, and the people were cool, and I have very close friends out of that experience. It was, I met maybe even more so than graduate school. I met a core group of people there that I still am tight with today.
Have you had some of them on the podcast?
I have. Yes. Although I haven't been back to Skowhegan. They've never asked me back.
Yeah, maybe it's because you didn't go into the lake.
That's true. I didn't drink the punch, so to speak. That's true. That's probably like a scarlet letter on me forever.
Right.
I didn't even go in the lake. No, but yeah, there was some amazing, I mean, known artists who went there, and there were some really funny stories about that place, but that's for another podcast.
Right, exactly. Right. So, all right. So Blue Collar, Warhol, Pittsburgh, Skowhegan. What about Thelonious Monk?
Thelonious Monk. Well, I became conscious of Thelonious Monk, I think, in high school when I would listen in Pittsburgh, when I would listen to the jazz station there, which was, oh God, I can't remember the name of it. But yeah, and I remember hearing Thelonious Monk and the name and seeing his image and being intrigued. And then when I was at Penn State, I was a jazz DJ at the radio station there. And I think that's when I dug in deep to all the Blue Note stuff. And of course, Monk was on it. But the real Monk hit for me was when I saw the first time the video of him playing, which was like just amazing. He was so idiosyncratic and just did his own thing. And, it's kind of magic. I think he entered my brain at the same time that Sun Ra entered the other side of my brain. And it was just, one of those mind blowing kind of like creative experiences.
You obviously love jazz, but your music took techno route, right? So, I mean, are you 50% jazz and 50% techno?
No, not at all. I'm like 100% everything pretty much, to be honest. I mean, I listen to you name it. I mean, I listen to just as much reggaeton as I do jazz or, electronic music. And I listen to classical and I listen to East Asian music. I listen to, all sorts of stuff. I'm kind of a music fiend. Like I like to take it in any shape, way, or form. I mean, I listen, and I have a son, so I'm listening to a lot of, it's kind of cool. Like I'm listening to a lot of like new hip hop or rap that I used to, I grew up on. My childhood friend who lived a couple blocks from me, he and his cousin would bring tapes of like Houdini and, Cool G rap and like all these like old, the beginnings of rap music, and I got into it back then. And then, so maybe I haven't listened to quite as much new stuff, but, and a friend of mine, Evan, who's in a band called Rat-a-Tat, does a lot of producing for, he did some songs on the Kanye record, the new one. And my son loves those tracks. And he's like, oh, this is your friend who did that. It's just kind of a funny, kind of connecting of generations or something. It's been fun. But yeah, I listen to all of it. I listen to bluegrass, ragtime, you name it.
And I don't think that's uncommon for artists because there's so much time spent alone in a quiet studio that you want to fill it up, and you can only listen to the same track so many times before you want to move on to something else, right?
Yeah, it's funny. There's some artists who dig music and listen to a lot of it, and then there's a lot of them who get myopic about it, which surprises me. Mm-hmm. Like a good friend of mine, Chie Fueke, who I did a podcast with recently, but I've known her since graduate school. She would talk about how she would listen to one song when she's making a show and like put it on loop, and because they want that consistency. So there's artists who do that too, and then there's even artists who don't listen to music, which I don't understand, but sure, there's
right.
different strokes for different folks. But
yeah,
there's some people who go deep and some people who are pretty limited in it.
Okay, so I feel like I've heard some artists talk about how they have to carefully curate what that playlist is because it can wind up reflecting itself in their work.
Sure.
What do you think about that?
I get it. I mean, there's days where I need that. You know what I mean? Like if I'm working on something repetitive, I might want something repetitive. Or if there's a certain aesthetic that I'm painting, I want to match it. And then there's other days when I could care less. I can listen to, I don't know, Snoop Dogg and be painting flowers. It doesn't, not that Snoop doesn't like flowers, but you know what I'm saying? Like it doesn't always have to lock in.
Understand he especially loves flower buds.
That's true. That's true. He does like organic growth.
So, all right. So we have a few more left here. What about the Pit?
What's the Pit? You mean like in graduate school?
That's right.
The Pit. It was you know what I learned in the Pit? I learned a couple things that I learned that slaughters are best seen from above, from like one. That's why the gladiator, I think those old gladiator arenas, like the people sat a little higher up. It's a little safer to be up there while the massacre is going. No, I'm just kidding.
It's just like being in the front row at a Gallagher concert, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's better to be in the balcony, let's be honest. No, the Pit was, that building was really amazing, I think, and brutal in the same time. And the one thing that I learned outside of the little kind of like, amazing comments that faculty would make and that people would talk about the work is I really understood that at that point when I was in school, that a lot of the talk about the work were the faculty sort of battling out their own ideologies, which in the beginning you think, well, that's BS. Why does it have to be about them and how they feel about what they feel? But then later on, you understand that that's actually really great to hear because you're like a fly on the wall while other people are hashing out their interpretations of imagery. And then you understand that different people have a different viewpoint on things and they bring a different kind of like toolbox, a visual toolbox to what they're doing. So I think that, it seems kind of like rough at first, and then you kind of find the value in it, I think, in the long run. And it wasn't as bad as people make. In hindsight, we dramatize all that stuff. Although there was some, not by me, but there were tears shed, and there were people, I think, who phoned it in or cashed out after
So
after that experience.
how bad was yours? How brutal was it for you personally when you went through it?
Oh, I was fine with it. I mean, I had a dad who would always give me the business and be tough on me, so this was nothing. But um, I do remember a lot of people just not liking my work, which was kind of tough. But then I had a few people who championed it or who thought it was, productive what I was working on. So I just maybe just clinged on to the good things and didn't focus in on the bad.
So, I have a really good idea of what your work looks like now. Were you making similar work at that point?
Not at all.
What about?
Abstract, like environments that were based off of fractal numerical grids that I drew out on pencil on the canvas before I started painting on top of it.
Kind of sounds like Terry Winters.
More like Julie Meritu meets like early Matthew Ritchie, maybe.
Oh, wow.
It was sort of math. I took a class on fractals.
Again, that sounds like a lot of work.
That was the point. The point was and blue collar. We'll
right.
Tie this all together. The point is you may not get this, or it may look like futuristic, and this may not jive with your sort of traditional view of what art should be, but you can't deny that I didn't work my ass off on it. That was what the number grids were all born out of. It was like hard work. Like I wrote, 1 to 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 on the painting before I started. So you can't say that it's not, hard work. Then I went to Skowhegan and I was like, this doesn't matter. That was a defense mechanism. So I just painted trees.
All right. Well, one last one. Japan.
Yeah. I mean, it's like half of my life in a way. I mean, my wife was born in Japan, and she moved here when she was like 6 or 7. I think it was 6 years old. And so our extended family are there, and the culture has been in my, direct family for, over 20 years. And I've shown there for a long time. And I love, even when I was younger, I loved ukiyo-e, Japanese prints, and I've always been drawn to that aesthetic. And it's a big part of my life, and we entertain the idea of moving there eventually when I get older.
Just have to figure out whether your son wants to take care of you there or in the U.S., right?
Well, taking care of medically, I think it's going to be a much better situation in Japan. Here, it's a little rough,
right?
Like healthcare, but yes, that's hopeful to think that he'll even want to. Yeah, I have a feeling he's just going to go do his own thing.
Right.
Boys, my wife always says that. Like boys, like girls, they come back home, they take care of their family. Boys just go do their thing.
Right. That's funny. So you said you have 2 shows coming up this year. Is that right?
Oh, during the teaching year. So in this past fall, I had a solo show in Japan, speaking of which, at Maho Kubota in Japan, which was, I couldn't go to it, but it was a great show. I mean, it was a great experience of sending that work there and working on it. But yeah, so this is the second in that sense.
Sure. And so what can we expect from the show that's coming up? Is it more of the same, or so is it branching out in any new ways?
I think my work is the way I felt about what I'm doing in it, and change, like the idea of change, is that it's always kind of microscopic. Like I'm always making small changes. It's kind of like the Van Gogh. Like if you look at a retrospective of Van Gogh and you look at the first painting and the last painting, they're so different. But as you walk through and look at all the paintings, there's not like huge jumps or anything wacky. And I think that's the way that I make changes, or that I'm responding to the world. So I'm just, whatever I'm interested in that time, I think of ways to paint that and how I might tweak the paintings to fit what I'm painting. So this work is it's called Escape Plan. It's all loosely related on, living through a pandemic and being shut in, but at the same time, sort of like fantasizing about being in other places as well. So it's a mixture of imagery that's you know, plain as day, like a COVID testing parking lot or a Pfizer building. And then there's stuff like, Niagara Falls or a flower field or, mountains with like the sun and trees. So it's this combination of the reality and the sort of like idyllic escape from that reality. And then, so the title is a play on that. It's a play of like, we all wanted to escape our apartments during lockdown, but and then there's the reality of an escape plan of thinking of, doomsday, like what happens if this gets really bad. And my work's always had that duality, so I think it kind of locked in.
So for somebody who isn't familiar with your work, how do you, a lot of times when I have artists on the podcast, I usually start with asking them, if you show up at a dinner party and you're seated next to somebody who has no idea what your work looks like, how do you describe it to them?
That's always so hard, right? It's like, what's your music sound like? It's blues. I know, like, you can boil it down to, representational imagery that's like semi-flat, but then there's some texture to it, and it's kind of architecturally built up. Like there's like layers that I build up almost like a collage, and and I'm inspired everything from like Japanese prints to pop paintings to I don't know, Warner Brothers cartoons to growing up in Pittsburgh. And yeah, it's hard to verbalize what it's like.
So and I think I've heard you talk about this before, and that is, given the internet of images and how we consume images, how people have a misconception about your work when they see it on their screen, because of the flat aesthetic. They just can't see what the work looks like in person in terms of the built-up layers and texture, and it's like having only seen a Mondrian online and never seeing a Mondrian in person, right?
Right. Yeah. You don't see all those little cracks and the little edges and stuff. Yeah. Yeah, that's always been there. That's even before the internet. If anything, the internet it maybe exasperates it because so much is shared online and you're not seeing as much in person. But at the same time, you can get details. You can get zoom in. We're back in the day, like a Mondrian, you're either going to the museum and seeing it, or you're seeing like a picture in 1967 Art in America black and white reproduction. You can't see anything off that either. So I remember the first time I went to the National Gallery and saw the Barnett Newman Stations of the Cross at the top, and I was like, well, holy like this is, I didn't think it looked like this in person. And even quote unquote flat stuff, like John Wesley paintings, like you could see the hand in there, or or Warhol screen prints. Like there's a lot of like stuff in there that you got to see art in person. It's, you can't listen to. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I just think about Rothko, right? All those color field painters, right? Part of the experience is being close enough to the work that it overwhelms you, right?
Right. Definitely. Yeah. And that was the point I was going to make, is like going to see a live show. Like if you go see, Nirvana, you're feeling the chords in your body. Like it's just overwhelming you, and if you listen to it on like your iPhone, it's not going to have the same. You still can get what it's getting at, but it's not the same visceral experience. It's like going to see a play and then seeing a play done on TV. They both work in a way, but they're totally different.
Artistic influences, is it all over the place? I see some Alex Katz in your work. Is that a fair assumption that there's influence there?
Alex Katz, I think, came. I love Alex Katz's work. I never really look at his work. Okay. Like, there's stuff I look at in the studio, like as I'm working. Okay. You know what I mean? And,
like what?
And I don't think Alex Katz is really there. It would be anything from, like Alan D'Arcangelo to Agnes Martin. I look at a lot, like a palette, and I look at a lot of sculptured video stuff too. But yeah, as far as like what I'm doing, like Sheeler and Warhol, and I look at a lot of Japanese prints like ukiyo-e, and there's this other genre called bijinga, which is like paintings of beautiful women, it translates to, but it's like they're painted. It's not, just wood block. And I look at a lot of that stuff, and then I'm looking too at a lot of like imagery, like posters and popular culture imagery and
Hmm.
graphic design, all that stuff. I think it all kind of seeps in, but I'm just as equally like I love abstraction.
Sure.
And when I look at abstraction, I look at it for the painting quality, and I'm looking at the sort of the sonics of the way that like those strokes sound and the feeling that it's giving you. And
Hmm.
I think that's just as much an influence on the way that I'm making a painting, you know what I mean, than a painting that looks kind of like my painting.
Sure.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. And so your work, there's like this printmaking sort of methodology in terms of having to choose. I feel like you choose a narrow palette to represent an environment that is full of infinite colors, right? And so
Yeah.
I feel like that palette has relates to the harmonics or the sonics that you're referring to. How do you go about making those choices? Because I mean, it's very conscious what narrow range you're going to work within, right?
Right. This is a good sort of musical parallel example of how I would draw, a comparison to that. So I feel like color in my life, using color in my images has always been like a feel thing. I know it's influenced by where I grew up and the palette around it. Like I think if I grew up in Brazil, I'd have a different color sense and palette than if I grew up in Pittsburgh. So I think the color is intuitive and it's influenced by my unconscious growing up and what I was around. And so I think it becomes a feel thing. And I use it purposefully in a lot of different ways. Like there will be some things that like one of the paintings in the show coming up is, a COVID parking lot, and there's orange cones and they're fluorescent orange. And that's just like a factual use of color that's supposed to signify that like caution or man-made things. So, but just like you said, there's this huge spectrum you can choose from with color. Like, how do you get to where you get? What's kind of a feel thing? It's kind of the vibe that you're trying to get across, and it does relate to your imagery, but it's not defined by that. And I think that's the same thing. Like, if you pick up a guitar, if you're a guitar player, there's so many sounds you can get out of a guitar, so many amps and guitars you could use. How do you fall on, a Les Paul with like a Fender amp, and it's like a feel thing. It's like how you want that tone to sound. And it's hard to define exactly what the feel is, but you kind of navigate towards a feel and a tone that you feel is yours, like Grant Green, the jazz guitarist. I remember reading a book about him, and his son was saying that to get his tone, he turned all his bass down and his treble down and turned his mid all the way up. And that was his tone, which is like a completely random way to get a specific tone. But it just, to him, that was the feel that he wanted, And I think we do that, or some of us do that when we're working with a palette. It's this combination of feel, comfort, and then pushing that and using things, explicitly. But it's, it's all kind of like serving the final thing you want to get across, which is almost impossible to define or to verbalize, but it's like a feel.
What's the size of the pieces these days? I mean, does it range?
Yeah, like the show I had in Japan was a lot of, I think the biggest one was like 4 by 5 foot maybe, and a
Mhm.
lot of them were in the 16 to 24 inch range, like smaller work. And just in Japan, it just works better there. It's hard to have huge. The gallery's not as big. The places aren't as big. It just works to have smaller things. The biggest painting in the show coming up is a triptych that's ginormous. I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's probably 18 feet long, maybe, or
Mhm.
wide, and maybe like 8 feet high or something. So it's pretty big. So they range this the work in the show coming up is mostly in the 5 to 7 foot range, like bigger paintings, and then there's a few smaller ones too.
So I know in the past you've made an animation to accompany shows. Did you create an animation for this one?
Yeah. There's the animation that I'm going to show in this one is called LA Trance, and I worked on it with my friend Ben, who I collaborate with. Ben Radatz, he's a motion graphics guy in LA that we've collaborated for a long time, since my second show in New York, so almost 20 years. And we did an animation based off like depopulated photographs he took from Los Angeles during COVID.
Oh,
So he
wow.
would go out and take all these images of, everything from Mulholland to Rodeo to, the Strip, and like all these places that are just vacated. And it was after a rainstorm, which is also weird for LA. So there's puddles everywhere. And the soundtrack is by Fortet. It's a song called LA Trance that we used for, we reached out and we thought that would be a great track to use for the animation, and he agreed to it. So it's kind of like a music video for that song as well. And yeah, so that is the animation for the show. That, there's a couple paintings in the show that are stills, like they're stills from that animation.
So I've seen your work on like Sedition. Have you thought about releasing any of those animations as NFTs yet, or have you already done that?
I did early on in the process. I made sort of like I minted a bunch of NFTs just because I was interested in it as a new medium and I was exploring it.
Mhm.
I've never really promoted it or tried necessarily to sell them, or I was just interested in how it operates in that landscape. But to be honest, it was kind of like the way I use social media. I just kind of like dump them there and then leave and go work and do other stuff. I think the hype of it has become, a thing. I think the idea of it is an interesting thing, but a lot of times the hype gets, it kind of kills a little bit of it in a way, as far as like the spirit of it.
Brian, I really appreciate your time this morning. If folks wanted to keep an eye on you and your work, where's the best place for them to check out? Is
All right,
there?
I'm ready. I'm ready to pitch it. I'm
All
ready
right.
to give. It's so funny because, at the end of my podcast, I always tell the artists like where can they find your work, and they're always, yeah, a little taken back, but I'm so used to that. Um, okay, so at Alfred Studios, my Instagram, and that's where I'm the most, active. And at Sound of Vision Podcast is where the podcast is. All the flyers and info for the podcast are. And I have a website at brianalfred.net. And the thing that I would love for people to check out is, this book, which just for the reason, like I think people will really like the stories in here, and the artists are amazing. So, and a lot of, I mean, we're doing a podcast. Some people aren't into podcasts, but even if you do listen to it all the time, this is a different thing. There's images. There's even like I had a guest book where people would like do sketches after each podcast when I did them in person. So we
Oh,
included
that's
some
awesome.
pages of those, which is kind of fun. It's like these funky, like little funny drawings that people have done. But the book is available through Atelier Editions. They're the publisher, and you can find it on their website or on the Sound of Vision podcast website. There's a link to the book where it can be pre-ordered, and it's coming out pretty soon. I think the end of May is when the scheduled release of it is, but it's available, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, all the other places too.
Cool.
It's kind of good if you can get it through the publisher, just more direct that way.
So just search for Brian Alfred, why I make art, and everything kind of falls into place, right?
There you go. Yeah.
Awesome. So let me ask you, back in the old days, you had a site, Paint Changer. What was the story behind Paint Changer?
I know, right? Is what's so weird. So when I was in grad school, I took a computer class in the lab, and basically the part of the task of it was to create a website. And this is how I'm getting older. Like, it was like make a website, and back then it was like GeoCities, right?
Right.
So you would just like and there was no like I learned HTML, so I had to like type this stuff out. So it's pretty basic, but the idea was I took a photos of a painting, one of those fractal paintings that I was doing, and I
Mm-hmm.
took it in stages. So every other day I would take a photo, and then I
Ah,
made a website, and the painting changed each time you clicked on it when you were in the website. And so I called the website. We had to come up with a title, and it wasn't going to be brianalfred.com at that point. It was GeoCities / paint changer or something. And that's how the name came. And then I made an email account, and it just became that was, the moniker for a while, or not a moniker, but it was just something I used for a while. And then I remember maybe a couple of years ago, my wife saying to me, it's like the paint changer thing is a little like, can't you just use your name? And I was like, no, some tax company in England took my name. They're called Brian Alfred. And so I can't use that. And then I looked and .net was available. So I just took that.
well, at least if you ever want to get into a career change, you can go into tax consulting, right?
Not only that, they sponsor a rugby team, like a professional rugby team. So there's a rugby team. I forget what team it is, but there's a team that has Brian Alfred on their chest, and they're out there destroying each other playing rugby, which is really weird for me.
That's awesome.
There's no Brian Alfreds out there. Like Alfred is a very rare last name. There's a lot of Alfords, but there's only a handful of Alfreds. So there's no Brian. There's like one other Brian Alfred out there that I know of.
That's crazy. Well, Brian, I really appreciate your time and your being so gracious as to answer all my questions and playing the Brian Alfred bingo card and stream of consciousness there. But been a big fan of your podcast for years. I've probably listened to somewhere between 150 and 200 of the episodes, and love your work. And it was a real pleasure having you on today, man.
Thanks so much. It was my pleasure. And, it's nice to not prepare and just talk, and just to, have questions asked to me. So I really appreciate that part of it. And thanks for listening to the podcast. It's always cool when I hear that people actually like it. I just do them and throw them into cyberspace, and, it's cool when people, dig into it and enjoy it.
Absolutely. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe, and while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. If you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read a transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to canvia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@canvia.art. Thanks for listening.